There are moments in life when silence screams louder than words, when you stand alone and trembling in the aftermath of a betrayal so sharp it slices through the soul, not just the heart. You question your worth, not because you've done wrong, but because others saw your goodness as weakness, and instead of honoring your grace, they made it a sport. They mocked it, twisted it, and celebrated your pain as if it added trophies to their pride. You offered love. They responded with laughter behind your back. You chose humility. They chose humiliation for you. And when they hurt you, they did not flinch. They flaunted it. With heads held high and voices loud, they turned your heartbreak into a parade of their so-called strength. They told the world you were naive, too kind, too soft to survive this brutal world, and they wore your suffering like medals earned from a battlefield they believed they won. But what they never understood was that the one who matters was watching. God was there, not just as a silent witness, but as a judge who never sleeps. He saw every tear you wiped in private, every time you held your tongue when they deserved your wrath. Every night you whispered prayers that asked for healing, not revenge. And he took note of everything. The universe, you see, is not as blind as people pretend it is. There is a divine justice written into the fabric of creation, a balance that cannot be mocked or manipulated. And while they boasted, while they raised their voices to glorify their actions, heaven remained quiet for a time, but only to let their pride rise high enough to fall in full view of everyone they tried to impress. You were not forgotten. Your cries were not ignored. You were being prepared. And now the silence of God is turning into a roar, a holy interruption, a divine reckoning. They laughed, but God was not laughing. They displayed their pride, but God was preparing their silence. They claimed they had won, but they had only dug deeper the pit from which they would beg to be pulled. So let us now explore how heaven deals with pride soaked in cruelty, and how the very God they thought absent is about to silence them forever. Not with rage, but with righteousness. God's eyes miss nothing. Every act of pride was witnessed. They thought they could hurt you and escape unseen. But they underestimated the all-seeing eyes of God. Nothing escapes his gaze. Not the sharp words spoken behind your back, not the deliberate exclusion meant to break your spirit, and certainly not the smirks exchanged after they made you feel small. God watched every act, not as a passive observer, but as a patient king collecting evidence for a verdict only he can deliver. Pride, when it wounds the innocent, becomes an offense not just against man, but against the Creator himself. Every boast they made over your brokenness was an insult hurled toward the heavens. And God, though long-suffering, is not indifferent. The scriptures say he is near to the broken-hearted. But it also declares that he resists the proud. The very resistance they tried to place in your path has now become their own divine opposition. The truth is, no tear was wasted. Every drop you cried became a seed planted in the soil of God's justice. And those seeds are now sprouting, not as flowers of peace for them, but as thorns of consequence. The pride that once made them shout will be the silence that binds them soon. They had their moment. But now, heaven is speaking, and when God speaks, pride must kneel. They turned their pride into a weapon, but God let them believe it was power. There is something dangerous about pride when it is not rooted in truth. It becomes not a sense of dignity, but a weapon, a tool for cruelty. They did not simply hurt you and walk away. They sharpened their words with the edge of pride, aiming them like arrows at the softest parts of your soul. They wore their ability to wound you as a badge of honor. Their pride did not arise from righteousness, but from their belief that they could injure you and face no consequence. And they did it in daylight, publicly, without remorse. They smiled when you fell, they laughed when you wept. They whispered lies to others while holding their heads high as if to say, "See how strong I am. See what I can do to someone so kind and still walk away untouched." They did not hide their intentions. In fact, they broadcasted them. They believed that if they painted you weak and themselves victorious, the world would applaud. But what they mistook for strength was actually cowardice in disguise. For only those who fear being exposed attack the innocent. Only those who carry emptiness within glorify tearing others down to feel whole. Pride, when it is rooted in deception, always requires a stage. And they built one with your suffering, stood upon it, and performed for those around them as if your pain were nothing more than part of their script. Yet God is not like the audience they play to. He is not amused by the show of pride. He does not clap for performers who build their thrones out of broken spirits. Instead, he watches quietly, patiently, and while they boasted, he allowed them to believe they were winning. He let them walk further down the road of arrogance, not because he was absent, but because the fall of the prideful is always from the heights they build for themselves, and the higher they rise in their own eyes, the harder they land when truth pulls them down. You see, there is a deep mystery in how God handles those who boast. He doesn't always stop them at the first act. Sometimes he lets them take center stage. Sometimes he lets them be seen and heard, their pride echoing through every room they enter. And this, too, is mercy, because in their loudness they reveal themselves. In their boasting they dig their own pit, and in their arrogance they set the stage for divine justice to be unveiled. He let them feel untouchable. He let them think their words were final. He let them imagine that no power in heaven or earth could silence them. But this was never because he approved. It was because he was setting the contrast. For what better way to display justice than to let the proud build a tower of self-glory, only for heaven to shake its foundations and bring it down? And you, the one they mocked, were never forgotten in this story. God was never aligning with them in silence. He was preparing something far more humbling than immediate response. He was not ignoring their pride. He was preparing to silence it so completely that even they would wonder how they ever dared to speak so arrogantly. Pride built on the pain of another cannot stand for long. It may rise like a wave, but it crashes just as hard. And when it does not just fall quietly. It collapses in such a way that even the dust it leaves behind becomes a warning to others. They used their pride as a sword, but it will turn in their hand. For no one holds arrogance before God and walks away unshaken. They thought your silence meant defeat, but God was writing a greater story. In a world addicted to noise, silence is often misunderstood. They saw your quietness not as strength, but as surrender. When you didn't retaliate, when you chose dignity instead of defense, they mistook it for weakness. They assumed that because you weren't shouting your side of the story from rooftops, you didn't have one worth telling. They believed that silence was the sound of defeat, but they never considered that maybe it was the sound of trust. What they couldn't see was what you were doing in that silence. While they mocked, you were healing. While they spread their versions of the story, you were learning how to carry pain without bitterness. You were drawing closer to the one who sees all things. And in that quiet space, you weren't alone. You were being held by hands far more powerful than theirs, guided by a God who knows that silence can be a strategy, not a sign of loss. They underestimated the strength it takes to be still. to choose not to retaliate when every part of you is burning to defend your name, to take the higher road when the lower one is filled with opportunities for revenge. They called you coward, but heaven called you courageous, because while they were loud in their cruelty, you were quiet in your faith. And faith, though silent, speaks to God in volumes the world cannot hear. They thought they had the final word. They convinced others with their twisted truths and their dramatic performances. They turned themselves into heroes in the stories they told, painting you as the broken one, the desperate one, the foolish one. But what they didn't know is that God was not finished. Your silence was not the end of the story. It was the sacred pause before God's hand turned the page. There's something holy about letting God defend you. It defies every human instinct. It tells the heavens that you trust His timing more than your own. And when you do that, when you truly lay your pain down and refuse to pick up the weapons of bitterness, you invite God into the battle. You give Him the pen. And once He begins to write, the story never ends the way your enemies expected. God does not rush His justice. He lets it unfold in layers, so that when it arrives, it teaches, it exposes, it redeems. He didn't stop them immediately because He was allowing their pride to be seen, their words to be recorded, their actions to testify against them, without your hand needing to lift a single stone. The longer they spoke, the clearer they made themselves. And while you waited in stillness, God was building something louder than their voices. And when truth arrives, it does not ask for a spotlight. It walks into the room, quiet but undeniable, and suddenly all the noise they made turns to confusion. All the crowds they gathered slowly step back. The voices that once echoed against you begin to fall silent. Not because you spoke louder, but because truth does not compete. It reveals. What they thought was your silence was actually your strength, wrapped in surrender. They didn't realize you were being protected from becoming like them. They didn't know that your restraint was a reflection of divine character, not human cowardice. And while they spent their energy tearing you down, God was using every moment to build you up. On the inside first, where it matters most. They told the world you were broken, but in the quiet you were being rebuilt by the very hands they mocked. And when God reveals the next chapter, the same silence they misjudged will become the echo of their regret. They believed God's silence meant His absence, but He was observing in righteous restraint. It is one of the oldest deceptions in history, to confuse divine patience with divine permission. They hurt you and assumed that because the sky didn't split and thunder didn't strike, God must not have cared, that He was absent, distant, powerless. They interpreted His silence as indifference, and that miscalculation led them to grow bolder in their cruelty. They did not merely act in darkness, they believed they were free to do so without consequence. But what they could not comprehend is that God is not reactionary. He is purposeful, and when He chooses silence, it is not because He is blind, but because He is wise. He does not act in haste, because truth that is fully ripened always pierces deeper than impulsive judgment. While they mocked and mistreated you, God was not watching from afar. He was standing beside you, recording each word, each glance, each motive behind the mask. His silence was not absence, it was observation, and not just of what they did, but of how you responded. He watched you take blow after blow, and not repay evil with evil. He saw you pray for understanding rather than vengeance. He saw you ask Him for strength rather than demanding justice on your own terms. And in that sacred restraint, you revealed more of God's character than those who speak of Him with their mouths, yet violate His heart with their actions. You see, The proud forget that the throne of heaven is not governed by human urgency. God does not strike down the wicked the moment they offend, not because he lacks power, but because he honors a greater law, the law of mercy before judgment. He waits, not to enable, but to give space for repentance. Yet when repentance never comes, when the arrogant use the silence of heaven as an excuse to continue their harm, then that silence transforms. It becomes the stillness before the storm, and they will not see it coming. Because in their pride, they believe they've outsmarted consequence. They think their lies have become truth by repetition. They think their masks have become their real faces. But they forget that God is not deceived by performance. He sees the intent behind every word, the posture behind every action. They can fool the crowd, they cannot fool the one who created breath. It is a terrifying thing to realize that while they were busy boasting, heaven was watching. That the very moments they wore as trophies, when they insulted, belittled, and wounded, are the very moments written down by the hand of God. And when the pages are turned and judgment begins, it won't be chaos that descends. It will be justice in perfect form, measured, holy, irrefutable. And while they thought they had silenced your voice, they did not notice the voice rising on your behalf. The voice that spoke when you had no strength left, the voice that echoed in the chambers of heaven with the authority of the innocent. God heard your cry even when no one else did. He saw the tears they mocked, and he did not forget. He does not forget. Their mistake was not simply hurting you. It was doing so with laughter in their throat and confidence in their heart, believing God had no opinion, no response, no power to intervene. But that is where they were most wrong, because the patience of God is never weakness. It is a waiting fire, and once he moves, nothing remains as it was. What they thought was permission was only the delay before divine interruption. They tried to rise by crushing you, but God never builds on broken souls. There is a kind of rise that doesn't come from effort or merit, but from pushing others down. And that is what they tried to do to you. They believed that your silence, your humility, your refusal to fight on their level made you the perfect foundation for their ego. So they stepped on you, not because you were beneath them, but because they couldn't reach the height they desired on their own. They mistook their climb for elevation, when in truth, they were simply climbing a pile of pain they themselves created. They used your goodness as a ladder, your kindness, your patience, your willingness to give chances even when they weren't deserved. These were the very traits they exploited. They took advantage of your hope that they would change. They interpreted your forgiveness as permission, and they wore your trust like armor while planning their next attack. To them, your heart was not a gift. It was a stepping stone, and once they had reached where they wanted to be, they looked down with scorn, as if they had arrived by their own strength. But God sees differently. God does not celebrate victories built on the backs of the broken. He does not honor achievements born of manipulation or lies. He does not reward cruelty simply because it goes unchecked for a time. The world may applaud the successful, but God inspects the soil beneath their feet. And when he sees that someone has risen by crushing another's soul, he does not build on that, he dismantles it. Because the heart of God is not impressed by appearances. He is not dazzled by the image of strength that comes from stepping over someone else's dignity. Instead, he moves toward the wounded, the ones who were used, forgotten, discarded. He binds what they broke, he honors what they humiliated, and in his timing, he lifts up what the world cast down, not because the world is watching, but because he was watching when no one else was. There is a truth so profound and terrifying that they fail to understand it. When you rise by hurting others, you build your throne on a foundation of curses. Every lie, every betrayal, every manipulation becomes a crack beneath your feet. And no matter how high they climb, it only takes one breath from heaven to bring the whole illusion crashing down. What they didn't realize is that in their effort to prove you small, they made themselves hollow. They stripped away parts of their own humanity every time they used yours against you. And they called it strength. But real strength never looks like cruelty. Real power never destroys the innocent to validate itself. And real success is never born from the ashes of someone else's spirit. God allowed them to rise, but not as a reward. He allowed it so their fall would be complete, because a fall that teaches is more merciful than a rise that corrupts. He let them taste the fruit of their ways, so that when it turns bitter in their mouth, they'll understand what they've done, not just to you, but to themselves. And while they thought they were building something great, God was measuring every beam, not with the world's ruler, but with truth. And truth never lies. It never flatters the guilty or ignores the wounds of the innocent. It waits, it watches, and then it speaks, not in whispers, but in events that cannot be denied. Events that shake the structures built on pain and raise up those who were buried beneath them. They boasted about the pain they caused, but God marks every mockery with justice. There is something unsettling about those who hurt and then laugh. Not out of ignorance, but out of intention. They did not stumble into their cruelty, they chose it. And once they saw the damage, instead of remorse, they found pleasure. They glorified it. They wore their betrayal like a crown, spinning their wickedness into a narrative of boldness and dominance. Their words were not apologies but war songs, sung with pride about how they broke someone who only ever meant well. It's one thing to wound a person in a moment of weakness. It's another to turn that wound into a trophy. They talked about you, what they did to you, as if it were a joke to be shared at parties, a story to gain admiration from others. They puffed up their chests and let your pain become a stage for their arrogance. They didn't care what it cost you because your cost became their entertainment. And for a while, it worked. People believed them. People clapped. People looked at you and saw weakness, and looked at them and saw boldness. But they forgot one thing. Heaven listens in the dark. God is not deaf to whispers, nor blind to what happens behind closed doors. He heard every sarcastic remark, every cruel joke, every moment they laughed at your tears, and none of it went unnoticed. For every time they mocked your suffering, God took note. Every boast became a mark, not a mark of success, but a record of cruelty written in the language of justice. There's a sacred weight to the pain of the innocent. God does not treat it lightly. He does not brush it aside like the world often does. When the broken cry out, it echoes beyond human ears. It travels into realms where justice is not delayed and mercy is measured with wisdom. The ones who boast about their sins against others may find applause in this world, but in God's courts, those claps turn to chains. They mistook temporary applause for eternal approval. They thought if people laughed with them, then God must not care, but they misunderstood silence for consent and delay for denial. What they didn't see was the slow turn of divine justice. Silent but sure, because God never lets arrogance escape untouched, especially when it stands on the ruins of the righteous. God's justice doesn't arrive in noise. It comes in patterns, in shifts, in consequences so tailored that even the one who mocked cannot deny the connection. And when it comes, it doesn't only answer the pain, It humbles the proud. It takes the very mouth that spoke with such pride and fills it with dust. It silences not just with loss, but with understanding. The piercing realization that they glorified what heaven mourned. And you, whose pain was paraded as weakness, will not remain forgotten. God does not leave his children buried in shame while the guilty dance above them. He lifts, he restores, and when he does, it is not just a blessing, it is a message. That what they ridiculed, he honors, that what they belittled, he exalts, that what they laughed at in mockery, he covers in glory. They thought their laughter sealed the chapter, but God was just beginning to write. They thought they had won, but justice had only begun to awaken, and in time they will look back not with pride, but with regret, so loud it drowns the echoes of every boast they once made. Because in God's world, every mockery has a price, and every boast written against a pure heart becomes a seed of their own downfall. God will silence their pride, not with anger, but with truth too loud to deny. There is a silence that humbles, a silence so holy it does not need to shout to be heard. And that is the silence God brings when he finally speaks. Not in thunder or spectacle, but in a way that unravels falsehoods and leaves no place to hide. When the time comes, he does not argue with the arrogant, he reveals them. He does not fight with their pride, he removes the mask, and in that unveiling their entire strength withers. They walked in confidence, not because they were righteous, but because they thought they had control of the story. They thought that the version they told, the one that made you weak and made them strong, would never be challenged. They convinced themselves that if they looked unbothered long enough, people would forget what they did. That if they carried themselves with enough pride, the weight of your pain would disappear. But God has a different memory than man. He does not forget injustice. He does not ignore betrayal. And when he moves, he does not need to destroy them with your name in his mouth. He lets their own lives testify. One event after another, one exposure after the next, one moment at a time, he begins to silence the pride they carried so loudly, and not by force, not by vengeance, but by truth. A truth too strong to bend, too bright to ignore. Truth is God's sharpest instrument. It cuts without cruelty, but it leaves no lies intact. It walks into the room quietly, and suddenly nothing proud can stand. Their stories begin to crack, their confidence begins to shake, and all the things they once said with arrogance lose power in the presence of undeniable reality. That is how God humbles. He does not humiliate, he reveals. And in that revelation, every false crown falls to the floor. You may not be there to witness it. You may not hear the moment when the truth finally speaks louder than their pride, but it will come. It always does. Because when you are on the side of truth, your absence cannot erase your innocence, and their presence cannot secure their lie. What they thought they won by speaking louder, God will overturn by showing deeper intent, deeper damage, deeper truth. And in that moment, everything they built on deception begins to shift. The relationships they formed based on the illusion of who they were begin to crumble. The peace they pretended to have begins to flee. The silence they thought would never break begins to speak in whispers that grow louder with every passing day, until eventually their pride, once loud, once fearless, stands alone. Not because you fought it, but because God never forgot. The strength of God's justice is not in its speed, but in its permanence. When he humbles the proud, he doesn't just silence them in public. He brings them into an understanding so deep It reshapes their view of everything. It's not about embarrassment. It's about awakening. They come face to face with the cost of what they did, and they realize it was never power, it was poison. And the pride they carried was never strength, it was weight, heavy, hollow, and now uncarryable. So when he moves, he silences not by striking them down, but by stripping away every false thing they stood on. He lets truth do the speaking, he lets justice do the unveiling, and he lets mercy decide when they've seen enough. Because his goal was never revenge, it was always redemption for the wounded and clarity for the proud. And in that holy silence, there is no boast left to give. Only truth, only God, and only the echo of what they can no longer deny.